Hello, everyone, and happy Valentine's Day. Welcome to today's webinar, Is DevOps Right for You? I'm Will Sherlin, Director of Content at 3Pillar, and we appreciate you joining us today. I'd like to go over a few logistical items before we dive into DevOps and whether it's a good fit for you. All attendees are muted by default. If you have questions that come up along the way, please feel free to enter them in the questions portion of the GoToWebinar interface, and we'll answer them or as many as we have time for at the end of the webinar. This webinar is being recorded and the video recording will be made available to all attendees after the fact. The slides we're covering are also available for download now, so feel free to download them to follow along if you would like. Our fearless leaders for this webinar are Jonathan Rivers and Dan Greene. By way of short introduction, Jonathan Rivers is the Chief Technology Advisor at 3Pillar. In addition to 3Pillar, his background includes technology leadership positions at PBS, the Telegraph of London, and Ad Juggler. Jonathan is a frequent speaker at technology events around the country and around the world, including the Open Mobile Summit, Digital Entertainment World, and Byte the Future, just to name a few. Jonathan, thanks very much for being with us today.
Thanks for having me, Will. It's a pleasure.
Absolutely. Dan Greene is our second panelist and the Director of Cloud Services at 3Pillar. Among Dan's many claims to fame are an article he wrote in TechCrunch titled, "What is DevOps?" when the DevOps movement was first beginning to pick up steam. He also authored a 4-part series for the 3Pillar website on building a microservices architecture using Spring Boot and Docker that has racked up more than 380,000 page views to this point. Dan, thank you for joining us today.
Glad to be here. I wish everyone a happy Valentine's Day.
Absolutely. So with all that as preamble, let me give you a quick look at what we'll be covering in today's webinar. We'll kick things off looking at the question, why DevOps, to explore why it has become such a popular approach in the development community over the last several years. From there, we'll go into the goals and values of DevOps, and we'll cover why DevOps is more a state of mind than it is a collection of tools or technologies. We'll also look at key practices and obstacles to overcome if you decide that DevOps is indeed right for you. Sprinkled throughout the presentation, we'll give you some examples of DevOps in the wild, and we'll look at lessons Jonathan and Dan have learned along the way that may well impact or influence the DevOps decisions that you make. We'll also introduce you to the DevOps Maturity Model, so you have a framework to evaluate whether or not DevOps is right for you. Last but not least, assuming you determine that DevOps is indeed right for you, we'll look at 5 steps to getting started so you can be sure you get off on the right foot, and 5 success factors you should consider to make sure you and your teams are thriving with your DevOps implementation. So, Jonathan, with all that out of the way, let's start things off today with one thing you recommend all the time. Stop asking, what is DevOps? Why should we all stop asking what DevOps is, and what do you recommend instead?
Thanks, Will. You know, it's interesting. I've built out DevOps teams for PBS, for the Telegraph, and a number of teams for our customers here at 3Pillar Global. And constantly when I'm out in the market, people are asking me, what is DevOps? Or I want DevOps, or I need DevOps. And every time somebody says that to me, I know they're actually speaking in code, because what they're really saying is, I hate my IT department and I want to go to this magic land where software gets into production much, much more quickly. And that's a true place. It does actually exist. The world of DevOps is very, very real, but it's so confused often with the tooling. DevOps isn't Chef or Puppet. It's not containers. It's a mindset. And that's all that DevOps is a mindset. And the more germane question, and really what we want to talk about today, is start asking, why is DevOps? And if you ask me why DevOps, it's one, because DevOps is awesome, but two, the first answer and the real answer why you want DevOps is to get code into production faster. Code in a software repository has zero value. The only thing that has value or creates value is working software in the hands of your customers. And that's the thing. DevOps is more about a cultural and a process shift, about breaking down silos, about merging development with operations, about how do I get thing from my developer's machine into production as quickly as possible. And it's a continuum. And before diving willy-nilly into things, you really need to think about what you're actually trying to accomplish. Any movement with DevOps has to be linked to business value, and any new team, any shift in what your team is doing needs to be clearly aligned with a set of business goals. And we've talked about why, but let's talk about alignment to those business goals, because that's what's going to make or break you in this. The first goal, time to value. Again, I talked about software being in a repository having no value, but this is the thing. Time is the most precious commodity that we have. Time is linear, time is finite. And when you don't have the new software that you have created in production, you're losing money, you're losing time, you're losing the ability to leverage it. The second, reliability to your customers, and having reliable software and reliable infrastructure is key. If you don't, your customers are going to flee. That's why you want to look at orchestration, automation, and making sure that you have self-healing that's available to you with DevOps. The third, scalability. Scalability is huge and one of the greatest benefits that DevOps has. And the ability to build an infrastructure that is increasingly large with less and less people to build it is hugely important. 5 years ago at PBS, we had built out our first DevOps team. We built out our first round of infrastructure. We had 5 people administering 200 EC2 instances and around 20 databases or so. We had the first rounds of orchestration, automation in place so that it would scale up and down based on load. If you flash forward 5 years later, that same infrastructure now exceeds 1,000 EC2 instances, over 200 different databases, and it's operated by 3 DevOps engineers. So we have 5 times the infrastructure with 2 less people needed to own and operate it. That's scale, that's nirvana, and that's what you want. And then the third is predictability. Velocity isn't speed, but it's consistency instead. And, DevOps serves the same function. You want to make sure that software goes into production repeatedly, that it goes in the same way every time, that when you say you're going to make a release, you actually make that release. Nothing is pulled back at the last minute. Nothing is changed because dev didn't match stage, didn't match production. It's making sure things are equal and that you can reliably get software into production. And with that, those are the business goals. I'm going to pass it over to Dan to start talking to us about the values of DevOps, because there are a set of values behind that, and I think they're really worth talking about. Dan, do you want to go ahead?
Yes, thank you. We took a look at why people were doing DevOps in the marketplace. We broke it down into those 4 business goals that Jonathan had just mentioned. But we also looked at what can be done in the sense inspired by the Agile Manifesto. We value X over Y. And so we took a look at what are the things that, if you truly are in love, as the day may be, for DevOps, what are the things that you value? We value automation over manual efforts. Anything that can be automated should be automated. Does that mean we'll never have manual efforts? Of course not. There'll be one-off things, but the minute you think about doing it the second time, it should be automated. In DevOps, you replace your resources more than repair them. In modern cloud infrastructures and even private cloud infrastructures, you can stand up a new instance if something crashes, rather than having the system be down for hours while you diagnose it. You take it out of the load balancer, bring up a freshly working environment, and you evaluate what went wrong in parallel. Which also brings up the concept of self-healing. You shouldn't require a person to be on call to stand up a server or system that crashed. The systems should bring themselves back up again. You shouldn't require anyone explicitly running a script for increasing scale of your system, or more importantly, from a financial perspective, decreasing scale. We believe in loosely coupling both teams and technology over tightly bonding them. Most people are on board with loosely coupling technology, whether that be through an API approach or via an interface model. But this also covers with teams, that teams should be loosely coupled to each other, each one dealing with their own world, with their own capabilities, and deploying independently. Whereas in the modern era, people are always beholden to other groups getting things done. In order for all of this to work, one of the key factors is transparency. People need to know what's going on to be able to make intelligent decisions. Hiding things, making sure that it looks like it works, but it really doesn't, isn't going to help your product in the long run at all. This one is a little bit interesting, that we looked at finding a set of shared standards is a far better value than an individual best-of-breed solution. So if the solution is you're using 3 different database vendors, 4 different programming languages, this is possible in today's infrastructures. However, the overall level of maintenance and support that you'll end up paying for this, and the cost of diagnosing issues increases exponentially. So it is typically better to have wherever you can, share some standards and approaches to overall make your environments run better. And that also helps with the automation as well. Once you can build and deploy systems automatically, you'll be able to deploy smaller units of work. This allows a substantially lower risk of releases. There's a lot less things that can go wrong when you deploy 5 changes than 500 changes. The last part we want to mention is around the concept of ownership. A team owns their product from concept to commit to customer, versus in a lot of environments you'll hear, well, it worked on my laptop, well, it worked in dev, and people throw their hands up in the air. It's about everyone taking responsibility for the actual delivery of the product features to your customers.
And Dan, I want to touch on ownership, because I think it matters so much with DevOps. When I was at the Telegraph, we had a development team, who was supported by DevOps, that wanted to throw code into production on a Friday. They had some features that they wanted to get out, and they'd been offered a pizza party if they got everything launched, but it was on a Friday. And they came to me, and this was against the rules at the time. We had a moratorium against deploying code on Fridays, and they came to me and asked for an exemption. I said, how confident are you in your code? And they said, oh, it's great. It's perfect. I tested it on my machine. It should be fine. And I was like, great. Let me have your cell phone number. And the developer looks at me and he says, what? He said, let me have your cell phone number, because I'm going to put it in the monitoring system. And if the software tanks over the weekend, the people on call are going to call you. And he said, no, absolutely not. I said, well, then you're not owning your code. You're not owning your part of this equation. You're not confident enough in it that it'll go through the weekend. And so we sent him away. And, this happened 1 or 2 times. And you fast forward a couple of months, and they came to us before a holiday. The same team came to us before a bank holiday, a 3-day weekend, and said, look, we've really got to get this into production. It's super critical. And I said, my price. 1 cell phone number. And he wrote it down on a piece of paper and gave it to me. And that's ownership, right? That is the breaking down of silos. That's transparency. That's ownership, where everybody was in it together. And they were so confident in the work that they did, that they were willing to get called and to share that burden. And that's really where it takes both sides of development and operations to come together to get to the magic of DevOps.
Well, yeah, and to add to that, if things are being deployed in a consistent, reliable manner, the amount of ways that it could go wrong because somebody followed the instructions wrong decrease massively. So it'll give teams a lot more confidence on that front as well. So what I want to do next is I want to take this set of values that are kind of inspired, like I said, from the Agile Manifesto, and kind of see how would those really map over to what people actually do for DevOps. There are a set of 8 practices that we've identified by breaking down all the various different tools and approaches and everything does of what does it mean to actually participate in DevOps. And it is more than just getting code in production. That is our code pipelines item on that list. But it's everything from ensuring that the system is being monitored and the people are being alerted, or more accurately, systems are being alerted to auto repair themselves. It's about having a planned version control system, and that's from everything from Git branch models to tagging strategies that all integrate with each other. Having your infrastructure as code or infrastructure management allows it much fewer manual steps to be done in the effort. And the less manual steps is, the more repeatable it is. The more repeatable is, the more reliable it is in general. And that's reliable because of testing. And I believe Jonathan has said manual testing is madness, and that I don't quite agree to that level, but manual testing is an ever increasing burden upon your company. If moving to automated testing means that you can keep up with new features rather than the inevitable growth over time of the total set of features of your platform. Code analysis, and this can be at the lowest level of having a set process for code reviews, but it can go all the way up to static code analysis and other tools in this space that automatically scan all of your code base for potential code smells, adding in your own testing for commonly found issues. An advanced practice that has kind of come to its fruition in the last year or two is failure testing or chaos engineering, which I just love that title as a thing. Netflix is infamous for having really gone all in on this. They've open sourced their Chaos Monkey suite of tools that will go through your production system and intentionally break things. That way, you know, if you have fault tolerance when you let loose a virtual monkey to destroy things and unplug wires within your product environment. The last thing I want to mention, and this is critical across all of the values and everything, is communication. Whether that is ensuring everyone's on the same page by having a shared chat room, whether it be through Slack or other means, or just making sure that everyone's on the same page by whatever mechanisms work for your organization. This goes back to transparency. This goes back to ownership. Everybody being on the same page is critical to make sure that all of these capability works.
So Jonathan, what are some things that are impediments or obstacles to implementing DevOps successfully?
Yeah, I mean, I'm going to start with change is hard, right? If change were easy, more of us would do it more often. And when you start talking about change in an organization, you know, it can be really difficult. Organizations don't tend to be agile. They can tend to be glacial. And so, you know, that's where you're starting. But really specifically, the first is sort of stakeholder buy-in and competing priorities. Remember, everybody wants something different. Everybody already has a full roadmap. I haven't gone into an engineering or development organization that has free capacity. You know, the next quarter, the next 6 months, the next year are already preordained. And so this new initiative is going to have to challenge some of those and take some of them out. You know, and the second is you know, sort of status quo. And people forget that what gets you here won't necessarily get you there. There's an entire book about that. And just because it was good enough in the past doesn't mean that it will continue to be good enough in the future, but people will defend their track records and not want to do something new. The next, and this one is huge for me, and I talk about this a lot. It's a huge concern that I have for the entire industry, which is a lack of skills and a lack of skill mismatch. Right? System administrators are dying out. They have been hired up by all of the cloud providers. There's not a good entry path for people who understand hardware, abstraction, virtualization, networking, the web layer, right? Those skills are just not really being brought into the new development base. And so many of the things need to do at DevOps at scale just don't exist in the organizations and can really handicap your ability to do it. Infrastructure or self-service infrastructure is the sort of next thing that's a huge obstacle. It's something that we tackled at the get-go at PBS. So at PBS, our design point was, I need a production-ready server in 15 minutes. And that was what allowed us to really experiment and grow, and developers could go into a console, click a button, and have what they needed. If you don't have that infrastructure, then it's going to be really hard to move forward with DevOps, because you're waiting on a lot of manual tooling to be done up ahead of time. Next, silos. We all work in organizations that have been siloed. Breaking down those barriers is difficult. In fact, I mean, that's what you have the term DevOps for, right? That's the smashing together development and operations, two silos working together. And then finally, fear, right? How are we going to be compliant? How are we going to ensure uptime? What happens if they have the ability to deploy straight into production? For some organizations, that's incredibly liberating. My developers can write code and put into production. We can grow, learn, and test. But if compliance and control is the cultural currency of a particular organization, you're going to get a lot of resistance there, because fear is an incredibly powerful force. Now, it's one thing to talk about obstacles, but let's talk about sort of victory, or what we've put together, which is our DevOps Maturity Model. So how do you know where you are? How do you know what to do next? Dan, do you want to walk us through the maturity model?
Sure. And just to give everyone a sense of ease, I'm not going to read this entire chart to you. This is a way of measuring against those 8 different practices, different levels of maturity on each. Where on one, we'll look at code pipelines, because this is obviously what most people tie into DevOps. It's about, are you doing small steps to improve the time it takes to get a feature into the hands of your customers? And so there's a series of steps, there's a series of levels of maturity that you can go through, all the way from making sure you're doing like entry-level continuous integration where you're building testing on every commit, all the way to advanced where I'm releasing it, I'm rollbacking, I'm regularly performing that even when I don't need to make sure all of those processes work. Because there's nothing worse than if you have a big giant undo button and you push it and it doesn't work because you've never had to do it before. So I think there's a lot of areas that we can look at across the spectrum of these maturity levels across these particular practices. And you can look at this and kind of get an idea of where your organization is in this life against these maturity levels. And an important message that I want to make sure we deliver is you don't have to be at the top maturity level for all practices for your organization. There's going to be a set of diminishing returns as you get more and more advanced in these capabilities. And what practices give you the least returns on advanced investments is going to depend highly on your organization. We've worked with customers where, because they're in the education space, they do all of their builds and releases in the summer. And once they do that pre-school year beginning release, all they can do is bug fix. And so for them, having rapid delivery of bug fix is more important than regular delivery of features. So they would look through all of these and pick what would work best for them, not necessarily trying to get to the highest level, the Netflix, Facebook level of thousands of code releases per day. They don't need that. Operate on what delivers the most value for your organization. And a way to look at that was to go all the way back to those business goals that we discussed earlier about DevOps and see how do these particular practices map over to those particular goals. This chart kind of gives a nice high-level overview of which particular practices to focus on if you want to prioritize which particular business goal that you get out of DevOps. It is not to say that they're not all important. Of course they're important. But for your organization, what matters most to you for this quarter? These priorities can change. Competitors come into the marketplace, technology advances. Your priorities as a business are going to change. So you may want to focus on different practices that are going on over time and revisit this on a regular basis. It's about making investments into your capabilities to lower the burden of getting features to production to your customers and making sure that they're available to your customers at all time. So once you have this, really the question that comes out is, well, this is all well and good, but what are some of the ways to get started? And Jonathan's going to talk a little bit about how you can get started doing these practices.
Yeah, the first part of getting started is being honest with yourself. And none of this is going to work if you're not sort of upfront and honest about your capabilities. So, before even looking at these 5 steps, look deeply into your organization. Take the time to canvass all of your teams. Get a good skill inventory. Make sure you know what capabilities that you have, what people that you have, and what you can bring to the table. It's going to make everything a lot easier. The first, right? Take a look at that maturity model. Again, be honest with yourself. Evaluate where you are in each of those areas. It's not about scoring at a 10 or a 12. It's about knowing where you are and mapping that to those business goals, and choosing what to do. The second, prioritize what you're trying to do in terms of the business value. Anything that you develop, be that actual software or be it DevOps and infrastructure, needs to be linked to business value. It has to be linked to a business outcome. Make sure that you're prioritizing what the organization itself finds valuable. Third, identify the investments that improve those outcomes, right? What can you do that's linked to that? Again, think about not what you want to build or what would be cool or what was on Hacker News, yesterday. Think instead about the business outcomes that you're trying to achieve and prioritize those. Fourth, and when I sort of pretend that I'm an executive these days and sort of in management, I talk about these sorts of things. Link it and prioritize it to ROI. These things have to get paid for, right? What am I going to get back for that investment? And look at the things that are going to give you the most bang for the buck. Cost benefit or price performance is huge. And so you have all the things that you want to do, but what's going to give you the most value for the least effort, and start with that. And then, plan your execution. Think about your cultural currency, think about your stakeholders, think about their roadmaps, and think about what is likely to be successful, what people are likely to find valuable, and again, prioritize those. Because if you deliver software or infrastructure or automation that teams cannot use, that teams don't want to use, you're going to find yourself in a spot where all the things that you've just built go unused. And again, that has no ROI. And you'll end up sort of getting dinged for that. And then, from 5 things about getting started, I want to talk about 5 factors that will determine success and your ability to be successful in all of this. And the first, and Dan talked about this, communication is key. Communication is going to be everything. We talked about change and change being difficult. And part of getting through change is over communication. What are you building? Where are you on it? How is it that going to impact your colleagues? What's it going to do for them? What might cause it more difficult? Again, you want to make sure that everything is out in public and things aren't being done sort of in private. 2, again, it's not just chef and puppet, right? It's not tools. It has to be about value and sort of culture change. So the things that you're building, you want to make sure that you're doing something for people and not to them. And if you're just delivering tools, you're doing something to them and not necessarily for them. 3, don't boil the ocean. You don't have to do it all at the same time. As Dan talked about earlier, you are not going to go from 0 to Netflix in a quarter. Netflix didn't go from 0 to Netflix in a quarter. It was a good 5 or 6 years of work for them. And be mindful of that. Pick the things that are going to move the dial, but don't try and do everything at once. Prioritization is key, and making sure that you pick the right projects. 4, avoid heroes. And I talk about this with my teams all of the time. You don't want heroes. You don't want somebody to save the day. You want to focus on the day not needing to be saved. And that means having really good knowledge sharing and really good infrastructure and things that are self-healed, right? You don't want people going to great lengths. You want computers to do all of that work so that we could do things that provide more value. And then, finally, and I talked about being honest with yourselves and with your organization. You want to go for optimal maturity, like Dan said. If you don't need to be at a 4, don't be at a 4, be at a 2. Make sure that you're where it is right for you at that time. Your company has to be able, or your organization has to be able to absorb the change that you're doing. And if that change is too radical or too far, then you're not going to have the sort of impact that you really want. And so from there, those are some of the challenges, but let's talk about how to mitigate some of those things. And I think that's, just important, right? Because there are going to be challenges as we do that, but it's how we get past them and how we build this into our organizations that's key. The first is understanding upfront, if you have not gotten started with DevOps, or you want to do more with DevOps, that you're asking for an investment. And we forget this sometimes because we get so excited about what we want to build. I'm, that way myself. But you're asking for 2 things out of the gate from your boss, from your management, from your executive team. You're either asking for more money or to go more slowly while you build out the DevOps, or you're asking for both. And so understand that you're already in the hole when you've made this ask and you've got the commitment. You have written a check, you're going to cash it, and you're going to have to pay that back. So the thing to really sort of mitigate some of these obstacles, work with your stakeholders to identify the optimal maturity. Again, it's not about what you want. It's about what your organization needs. And remember, they're your customer in this. And so you want to talk to your customer about what they need and then use that to build out what we think the optimal maturity is and shoot for that. And then connect the projects that you're doing to those business outcomes, right? So make sure that you're clearly communicating what people are going to get and how that's going to drive the business forward. I can't emphasize this more strongly. If you can talk about DevOps in terms of business outcomes with your stakeholders, you're going to get a lot more support. If you can explain to somebody that you can get a release into production a week faster if you make this investment, that's a week worth of revenue that they could be collecting from all of their customers. This is very, very tangible, and you want to start adopting that language. Third, string the investments together. Start leveraging the success, build momentum, go from one success into another success. Make sure that the projects that you're doing are complementing each other and aren't sort of piecemeal scattershot, and that you're building sort of a cogent body of work that's really driving the value. Fourth, asking for help is not a problem. It doesn't mean you're weak. It doesn't mean you're dumb. If your organization lacks the core competencies or the skills needed to accomplish a product, don't be afraid to go outside. Again, this is about getting code into production faster. It's while you can learn, and you will learn, if it's faster to call an expert to move the dial forward, to start and jumpstart the process, don't be afraid to do it. And then finally, educate your stakeholders about the consequences of not doing it. And I use QA automation as a perfect example of this, because if you rely solely on manual testing, when you have one feature, that's really easy to test. But when you have 2 features, that's also really easy to test. But when you get to 100 features, the amount of time that it takes to manually test that is going to start delaying that code into getting production. And so if you don't invest in automation early or often, then the cost of testing is going to increase in a fairly linear fashion. And you don't want that. So never exaggerate, don't really go over the top, but make sure that you're being honest and sort of upright about what's going to happen if you don't make these investments. And sort of, I think talking about that in a sort of a very, very practical sense, I'm going to turn it over to Dan to talk to us about a perfect example and something near and dear to my heart, minimizing time to value.
Yes. So we talked about minimizing time to value being a business goal that drives our continuous code pipeline capabilities. And so this is kind of a visualization of looking at where the investments come in, the value that your organization gets out of it, the cost that everyone's, if you can see, it's all pretty linear and spaced out for the first few steps of getting into some automation, getting some scripted deployment. But there's a kind of a big jump in cost between scripting deployment and automating deployment, and almost the same amount when you get to a continuous delivery or continuous deployment methodology. As we've said time and time again during this, finding the optimal place for your business where you're not wasting resources of making this investment, but also you might move on to another. It might be worth it for you to get better at another set of capabilities rather than pushing hard on delivering, making sure that every time a developer commits code, that automatically flows magically to production. Maybe that's not right for you. Don't use that time on those efforts. Use it on other efforts, making sure that you have better test automation, make sure you have better monitoring, improving the quality of your infrastructure, or scaling up and down as needed. It's really key that what you want to do is build upon your successes. There was another potential risk on this is you're going to try something and it could potentially not work. Like everything in life, I learn a lot more from my failures than I do from my successes. And so I would take any of these efforts that you try to do and maybe it's not working, figure out why it's not working and adjust. Maybe it's the wrong tool, maybe it's the wrong team, maybe it's the wrong entire practice. Maybe you should be working somewhere else until you get a little bit more comfortable in the space. We talk a lot about the investment, it kind of returns upon itself. It's really going to help you. Any little success is going to help. So don't let any things that aren't successful get in the way. It's better to take a smaller bite and succeed than try to make a big, large bite and fail. Or to put it another way, investments yield compound interest. And by this, we mean everything you do helps the next thing go faster. And that is not only in terms of improving your DevOps practices, but also your product. Your product itself coming to market is going to gain a lot more by having all of these capabilities supporting it. Your product will be more stable. Your product will be more scalable. Your customers will be happier. Performance of the system will be in line with the price you're paying to run it. And of course, getting those features into your customers' hands. I mean, it's really interesting that we do this. And Jonathan, I don't know if you had any thoughts on this as well.
Yeah, I think really compound interest, it's you start thinking about the return on investment around the delay of release, the return on investment that happens when your developers are no longer fixing production, the return on investment when overnight support problems are no longer wrecking sprints, the return on investment around automated testing that I just talked about. You know, these things start paving the way for more and more productivity. They raise morale, they get code into production faster, they make things less expensive to execute. That's the compound interest here. A engineering group supported by solid DevOps practices is efficient. It uses only the energy that it needs to operate and then can spend all of the rest of their energy on things that provide business value. And, you know, waiting for new infrastructure, waiting for something to be fixed, that has no value. That's just mitigating cost. That's why DevOps is such compound interest, because it's creating additional value every step along the way, and it multiplies the more and more you do.
So Dan, you mentioned that you learn more from failures in life than from successes. What does DevOps gone wrong look like?
Well, it can go wrong in a lot of different ways. Some of the ways that we've captured out in the marketplace is DevOps becomes pseudo-ops. And by this, I mean, somebody stands up a DevOps flow that really exists to bring the delivery bundles from the development team over to the operations team. Kind of mirrors back to that movie Office Space, that I bring the requirements from the customers to the developers. But when you have a team whose sole job it is to hand off materials to another team, they're not really doing it. Another potential failure is just saying, oh, we have a DevOps team. That is really just renaming your operations team 8 times out of 10. That's not the point. The point is to smooth the flow of all of those capabilities and share the burden of them across these teams. And so the developers gain more insight to the production operation of your product, and the operational staff gain more insight into how the product is built. And you can work together to ensure that all the capabilities we've talked about can be delivered to your customers. If you deploy DevOps and everything you're doing slows to a crawl, take a step. It is not unusual for when you start implementing new projects and new ways of delivering code that your velocity might slow down a little as you're getting these items put onto you. As Jonathan mentioned, asking for more time or asking for more money. This is why taking smaller bites and finding a few victories, particularly ones that can provide an ROI value that management or your customers themselves can see a lot of value in, and then build upon those successes. Don't do everything at once, because that will crush your velocity. And you really still have to get features out to your customers while you're building this pipeline and these capabilities. And there's a concern in the marketplace around, if I automate this stuff, how am I going to make sure it's secure? I've done a lot of work in the government space where the government would have an entire team to check the work from a security perspective. That was done manually every single time. To me, that is a higher security risk than having your security team or your others be involved in the regular application of your practices, whether it be compliance or security or governance or what have you. Having those automatically being analyzed can go a long way. And when you start thinking about DevOps, the term security comes up. You'll hear a term called DevSecOps, which I think is just our way of adding DevOps around everything else nowadays. These other dimensions that are always brought up in the context of DevOps, I really think it's more of an intersection. It's not that DevOps is security or DevOps is performance. It is a means for these capabilities and these important things to be applied to your product. And whether you include security as part of your test automation or your penetration or your infrastructure management, is you harden the instances, the ports, the environment. These are things that intersect DevOps, but they're not DevOps themselves. Reliability, performance, obviously we talked about scalability and resilience earlier. Everyone has their own performance and reliability needs, and whether it's zero downtime failover, or whether it's ensuring that my environment can scale up to tens of thousands of users and then scale back down to hundreds of users automatically, your requirements and your maturity for your organization is going to be different than just DevOps. Disaster recovery is a really interesting model because with infrastructure management, you can stand up a pilot-light sized environment in an entire other region, entire other part of the world, and scale it up as needed. These are really incredible capabilities that you gain a lot more strength in as the rest of your organization is improving those other capabilities. As I said, they intersect them, but they don't necessarily are on top of each other. But so we've covered a lot of stuff today. And so we really want to make sure that Jonathan hammers home a few things.
Yeah, no, I think, if you're going to walk away with anything, the first, and I can't stress this more, frame your DevOps initiative in terms of business outcomes. Don't make it about the technology. Don't make it about speeds and feeds. Don't make it about faster and bigger and better. Link it to your company's strategy, your product strategy, and how you're going to achieve those. That's how you're going to get the buy-in that you need. That's how you're going to get the funding. That's how you're going to know if you're actually successful, because you're aligned to the business outcomes. When you start at that point, everything is going to be much more successful. The second, focus on optimal maturity. I talked about what does your organization need? What do they find valuable? from those principles, and use those. Don't shoot for maximum maturity in everything. Do the minimum possible, again, to achieve those outcomes in a way that it's comfortable for your organization. If it's comfortable, the change will be easier, you'll be more successful, and again, you'll be shooting for the right things. And then finally, pick the projects carefully. What is the smallest thing that you can do that will have the most value, that will then string into another success and another success? If you pick the wrong projects at the get-go and experience failures, you might not really get the buy-in that you need. The organization might withdraw funding. And so the first things that you want to do, you want to make sure that you're successful at. You want to make sure that they're aligned to actually show business value, and that people can clearly see the value and ROI that they're getting. And so with that, I think, if we have any questions or a little bit time for questions, Will, where are we with all that?
We do have a few questions, and I will also just mention that we have turned the maturity model framework into a survey that you can take, that we will be following up with everyone who's on the call, so you can see where you fall in the DevOps maturity assessment. And so if you have additional questions, please feel free to ask them in the questions tab. But let me start off with this. What's the biggest impediment to starting up a DevOps group?
Yeah, I'm going to say, so the joke is IT, but sort of, being a little less pithy, it's about risk tolerance. And so, by changing the way that you're doing things, and by changing the way that software goes in, or changing the way that your infrastructure sort of operates, that's going to imply a new element of risk into your organization. Now, your IT group has probably been built around minimizing risk, right? And the only way to minimize risk is to resist all change. Uptime and change generally don't go hand in hand. And so having good buy-in from the people who run IT, from a good buy-in from the executive and management teams to understand what their risk tolerance is, what their risk profile is, and being upfront and honest and addressing that is going to be huge. I think that one has killed more DevOps initiatives than any other, probably other than cost.
And I would add to that, the biggest impediment of standing up a DevOps group is probably the attempt at standing up a DevOps group. You want to get those successes on that smaller scale before you try selling an entire group dedicated to the effort. Find out where it works first. So plan it out, make some strategy. Just trying to justify standing up an entire new group of effort, that's a huge investment that you're asking for a very slow start, because if you do it a whole group, they're going to be expecting to be across your whole set of products. That's just my opinion. We've talked a lot today about small victories, so I wouldn't start a whole group at first.
And so this question may dovetail with that one. How do I sell the ROI of DevOps to my executive team?
Yeah, and I talked a little bit about that around the sort of the compound interest section, and it bears repeating. ROI around the delay of release. If I can take my release cycle from monthly to weekly, that means I can get paying customers into production faster. And so can I actually increase revenue by having software available more quickly? Second, churn. Linking it, customers, how many customers have you lost because of unreliability? If you can prove through your DevOps principles and practices that you have reduced churn from 10 to 5%, that's a clear monetary, gain. And then, finally, again, the ROI around automated testing. If I can test a release, if manual testing costs me $10,000 per quarter, and I spend a month automating that and get the cost down to $2,000 per quarter, those are very, very clear cost savings. And so how do you look at the work that you're doing, the compound interest that it's generating, and then translating that into very, very real dollars that the executive team can understand?
Okay, the next one is, can you share a practical example or two from your experience of how DevOps saves companies money and accelerates time to market?
Yeah, I think a great example of that, and I'll link this to sort of risk tolerance that I had talked about some. At PBS, we did a cloud migration from a data center, out into Amazon. Did the same thing at the Telegraph. Two teams doing it, two different ways. PBS leadership and management really wanted speed. They wanted to get there, and they had a lot of support and a lot of tolerance for risk. And so we did that cloud migration in about 3 months. And we picked an exotic technology that we probably shouldn't have, and ended up with a small number of errors and some viewability problems for a month or so while we ironed all of that out. We probably dropped 0.5 or 0.05% sort of uptime, but got there much more quickly. Telegraph, very risk intolerant. They believed in reputational damage. They believed in everything being exactly perfect. 100% success, zero downtime cloud migration. It took a team twice as large 1 year to build out the infrastructure and do that move. Now, those are very real dollars and pound sterling, right? That is, and that's how you tie things together. You can go fast and maybe break a couple of things and stumble and achieve value quickly, but with a little different trade-off, or you can be perfect, but it will be very slow and very expensive.
Okay, does DevOps in the enterprise exist?
So there is a WinOps movement. My former colleague at the Telegraph, who's now their director of IT and won the upcoming CIO of the Year award over in London, Carol Johnson, is a huge proponent of deploying DevOps principles into enterprise IT. They call it WinOps. It's a nascent. It's a very nascent movement. I think many sort of IT groups, especially those that practice ITIL, DevOps sounds very weird and freaky to them, and so it's taking really forward-thinking IT leaders to engage in it. It's just starting to happen, but it is the grassest of all roots movement.
Yeah, and I would add to that, a lot of what enterprise shops care about are these like ITIL processes and checklists, ensuring that you follow things exactly the way they said. Nothing's going to do that more than automation. A person checking an item off a list is far riskier than having the system automatically check it. So you have to make a different set of investments. You have to invest in what the business cares about. In this case, it's regulations and checks. Having these things baked into your infrastructure, baked into your release processes, make the process substantially lower. It can potentially go from a person reviewing things over the course of 2 weeks to maybe they just get a report that shows that the system analyzed it, and it becomes more of a check. Everything looks good. Okay, I'm good with this. Reducing the cycle of releases in enterprises is hard. Anything you can do to lower that barrier is going to help you massively.
And Jonathan, maybe I should know this, but what does the Win and WinOps stand for?
Windows.
Okay.
So it's it's sort of a play. Generally, if you're doing DevOps, you're doing it with open source software. Sort of the tools that you should be using. And so when you start talking about enterprise, most of that is Microsoft and Windows based, and so that's that's where they start identifying as WinOps.
Okay, got it. Well, we're getting close to the 3 o'clock hour, and we've also answered all of the questions that are in the queue. If you have additional questions for Dan and Jonathan, please feel free to use the communications@threepillarglobal.com email address that's on the screen in front of you, and we will be sure to pass those questions along. Thanks very much to everyone for joining us for today's Valentine's Day webinar on whether it makes sense to marry development and operations in your company. As we mentioned in the introduction, we will make both the recording of today's webinar and the slides available to you in a follow-up email. We'll also include a link to the DevOps Maturity Model framework and assessment so that you can fill it out and find out how ready you are to implement DevOps in your organization. Thanks again for joining us. We hope that you enjoyed the webinar and that you learned some valuable lessons along the way.